knowing absolutely nothing about swordsmanship. Oop, no.
Oh, we have had an issue with our stream, so welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 6, Episode 12. We, Andy, Least and I, are happy to be joined by Greg. I'm going to do this all again. We've literally had 3 minutes of chat before this happened. Greg, why don't you start again and introduce yourself to everyone who's just joined us?
Yes, thank you. A little bit of Groundhog Day going on here.
Yeah.
So, hello everyone, my name's Greg. So I'm an independent tabletop RPG designer based here in Edinburgh. So I operate under the trading name Gregorian Games. And my main product at the moment is Runesword RPG, which is a sword and sorcery adventure game. But the second string to my bow is that I'm a historical fencing practitioner and instructor. So I run a club here called Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy, or ERFA for short, and we specialise in 16th century Italian swordsmanship.
And I was quite interested the first time we had this discussion 2 minutes ago as to how you got interested in particularly 16th century Italian swordsmanship and indeed Italy in general.
Yeah, so when I first started practicing historical fencing, I just joined in with whatever was going at the club I was visiting at the time, and they had like a wide range of weaponry and styles on the syllabus. And then over time, I just kind of became most attracted to Italian styles, I guess. There's a kind of there's an elegance to them combined with a sort of brutality as well, which is strangely appealing. And I also have to say that the 16th century weapons are particularly cool, I think. Like the swords themselves just look really nice.
So give us a bit of a description of like, why are they so cool? What would a sword look like from the 16th century?
So I should have had a prop here to show you all, but I don't. So the thing is, when you transition from the medieval periods, so 13th, 14th, 15th century, and you hit the Renaissance, there's that kind of burgeoning of all kinds of arts, crafts, and sciences in Europe, and basically design and also practical things like metallurgy take quite a big leap forward. So you get basically fancier swords, more specialized swords getting made there, and the hilts of that period are typically very ornate. Not in an impractical way, though. These are definitely like murderously effective weapons, but the weapons at that time started to be carried as sidearms, both in the military and in civilian life. So you get people carrying weapons as a status symbol. So they basically bling them up in order to show them off, which means that aesthetically they're very beautiful, I think.
And that was when you sort of began to get things that were more specialized for dueling, right? Like rapiers and things appeared around.
Yeah, that's right. They sort of creep in at that period, yeah.
So those of you that don't know, my daughter Laurie and I practice Iaido, which is traditional the art of drawing the sword, traditional Japanese. And this is not a shinken, it's not a sharp blade, but it is a metal blade, and it is beautiful. So I just thought, as you didn't have a prop, I would bring the one along.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've got some Lego swords up there.
Yeah. Once you get to higher dan grades in Iaido, you do start to practice with a shinken. So at some point, I will have to choose a traditionally forged Japanese sword, which is super exciting. This is actually Josie's, I think, not mine. Mine's purple, but someone else in the dojo's borrowing it just now. Cool. Yeah. Random. Iaido, typical elf, yes. So, traditional rookery question. What's the first RPG you played, owned, and GM'd before we get into combat RPG?
Right, so before I got into, let's say, proper RPGs, my sort of gateway to it as a kid was two things, fighting fantasy game books and the Hero Quest board game. So they basically trained me in the art of role-playing without me actually knowing what a role-playing game was. And then after that, I discovered an old dusty copy of the red box Dungeons and Dragons Basic in the back of my parents' cupboard. So that was the first proper role-playing game I played, I guess. But I changed really quickly onto Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, and it almost immediately became the DM for that, and that was my bread and butter for a long time. So that's the early years of role-playing for me.
So Smiling Tom asks, gets right into it. Where can we draw the line between RPG combat and combat simulation?
Yeah, this is a big question, actually, and there isn't really a universal answer for this because it's very much a matter of personal choice, and my tastes in this have changed over the years. So to keep things simple, I would say, I mean, all RPGs exist on a spectrum from basically something like a tactical war game at one end of the scale and a narrative storytelling game at the other. And RPGs mix those elements to a certain extent, but each game system is on a spectrum there. So yeah, the line between RPG combat and combat simulation, I mean, the line is that RPG combat contains narrative elements to it, and elements of characterization, while combat simulation, a tabletop war game, does not. It's just looking at statistics of units and rolling dice and stuff. So I think that's important to remember when we have this type of discussion, that there does need to be some narrative element to RPG combat, but the amount of narrative that you have will vary according to personal preference.
And it can be tricky as well, like depending on the systems, because some systems actively encourage that narrative to go in, and some systems don't necessarily actively discourage it, but because you're so busy rolling dice, the describing what those dice mean becomes more and more abstract as you go on. And it's certainly something we've been conscious of in our Lawhammer streams of the more we get into the thick of it and it just starts becoming like rolling numbers, we need to remember to step back and keep the narrative in so that people who are watching it are actually enjoying it rather than just hearing a bunch of numbers being yelled out at random.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, as I said, that's a decision for everyone. So when I was younger and first getting into RPGs, this is kind of funny actually, because I've had this chat with some of my regular gamer colleagues that when I played Dungeons and Dragons, the basic box set, and then I found out about the existence of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, it was like, oh, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, that must be the game for grown-ups. So I played that one. And of course, it is quite a bit more complex than D&D Basic. For those of you who know the 2E rules, it is quite crunchy in places, actually.
A lot of tables.
Yeah. A lot of tables, a lot of different dice, a lot of different number scales to keep in your head. And so I guess at the time it was a challenge to kind of learn those rules and interpret them and work out what to do with them. And over time, I've really moved away from that. But I know that other people maybe haven't, and they still enjoy that. But for me, the narrative element has become more and more important over the years, and I'm kind of leaning more in that direction than the simulation direction in general these days.
Yeah, and I do wonder that now that many people, young people's first encounter with roleplay is probably going to be live streamed games, how that will change rules in future, how it will adapt to that being the method that people are consuming RPGs as a spectator sport as much as something that you do yourselves, which of course wasn't really what we did when we all first came to RPGs. You wouldn't go around to your friend's house. You might go around to your friend's house and watch them play a game of Warhammer Fantasy Battle together before you got on the table and played it, but you certainly wouldn't watch their campaign.
No,
your Warhammer campaign before you did your Warhammer campaign.
Exactly. You'd be in at the deep end. You'd be drawn in.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I was just going to say, when I read this question, I immediately jumped from RPG combat and combat simulation and jumped straight into LARPing. Like, I thought that's what Smiling comment.
LARPing is a pool that I have not dipped my toe in, I have to say, so I couldn't really comment about that.
No, but interestingly, like, I get that, but what you do in your fencing is a different kind of combat simulation itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It is literally attempting to be a simulation of combat. And in fact, as a fencing instructor, I'm quite careful to tell my students that what we're practicing is ultimately a way of killing people with weapons. And that's not because I want to train psychopathic killers, far from it. I want people to respect the weapons, respect the art, and realize that it's dangerous. And for us, it's fun as a hobby, and it's intellectually interesting, and it's good for fitness and so on. But ultimately, such a system is for killing people, while a fantasy narrative, whether it's in a role-playing game or in a fantasy book or a film or whatever, it's entertainment, which is something quite different.
Yeah, and I remember I've done far, far, far less than you, obviously, but the little time I dabbled my kind of toes in HEMA stuff, like the very first session, they were like, right, this is your first session, that you've got to understand these things are dangerous and we are going to be hitting each other with them, but only under our instruction, and you don't just wave it around, any of that stuff, and you're out. And you're like, okay, good. Because that actually made me feel safer. The more they explained how dangerous it was, the safer I felt, because you realized everybody was taking it seriously, and it wasn't just a free-for-all, hit each other with bits of metal, because that would hurt.
Yeah, exactly.
I was terrified the first time I was at the dojo. Like, and the first time I picked up a bokken, like a practice wooden blade, like my hands were literally sweating. And now, like, a bokken's just a bokken. And then the first time I picked up a E12, which, although I say it's blunt, I mean, the tip is sharp. You could still kill someone with it, both by stabbing and bludgeoning. Like, my hands were really sweaty.
Not that you've thought about it. But...
No, of course I haven't. But we talk about that all the time, much like you say, to say, like, this is dangerous. There are strict rules about how you practice in the dojo and what you do in the dojo, for everybody's safety. If you're not a member of the British Kendo Association, if you don't have your insurance, then you're not even allowed through the door of the dojo to pick up a weapon. Like, it's very strict, and I think it has to be. I don't do Iijutsu, I do Iaido, so it's more about the art, or like the practice of a bu itself, so what it does to you mentally and the way you act and the kind of person that it helps you to become, rather than being a jutsu where you're more combative.
Yeah, and these are all interesting aspects of the martial arts. So yeah, the physical and literal simulation of combat. And I think in role-playing games it's something quite different. So I think we're going to have some related questions later on about how we try to simulate these things with rules and so on. But ultimately, we're trying to achieve something different when we do a role-playing game. So yeah, the narrative aspect is vital.
Yeah. Seago asked, combat is boring when it's reduced to single dice rolls, but also boring when you try to simulate combat minutiae. How best to balance this at your table? And as a follow-up, just something to think about after, swing and miss is synonymous with undescriptive combat. How do you make combat feel more visceral with only a few rolls?
Yeah, these are really good questions, and ones which I asked myself repeatedly when I was designing the Runesword RPG. Yeah, so again, different strokes for different folks, so to speak. But I think the idea of having a few dice rolls to simulate a sword fight, for example, between two people is good. You don't want loads of dice rolls, because that does just become a mechanistic thing, and definitely strays into war games territory. Which isn't really what you're trying to achieve with a group role-playing exercise. I think that for some people, the single die roll narrative resolution for combat would be fine, actually, but not personally for me. I do like to have a bit of to and fro in a combat. How best to balance this at your table? Honestly, I think it's about controlling the numbers. And what I mean by that is firstly, you don't want to have so many skills, special abilities, and modifiers that everybody needs to perform this massive calculation every time they want to swing a sword. So I think you either want to choose a simple game system, or if you've already settled on a game system, you want to see if there's stuff you can strip out of it to reduce the numbers that you have to juggle when you're doing combat. But then the second aspect of that is thinking about health and how health is recorded and monitored in a fight. So if you have, let's say, a high-level character in the sort of Dungeons and Dragons type of game who's got 127 hit points, and you're fighting a dragon that has 352 hit points, that's going to be a mechanical exercise to resolve that fight. You know, it's going to go on for ages, and you are going to get loads of these situations where you're like, yeah, I missed. The dragon attacks, it hit 15 damage. I attack 2 damage just for hours. You know, like that's dull. But if you reduce the combat to something which is manageable in, I would say, 2 or 3 rounds, then you get that pace up and you get that excitement. You also get the sense of danger. And how you do that is just by giving everybody less hit points, ultimately.
Yeah.
Another thing I think is interesting on that, and again, like I genuinely, I'm amazed none of our regular viewers have set up like a Rookery bingo card for when we do these streams, for when I revisit the same Targol well of things. But to talk again about Blades of the Dark, which is a thing that I do quite a lot. What I love about that, and I think it's because I love it and I read it, but I've never got to actually play it, and I think that's why I'm so obsessed with it. But what's interesting about that is, and I think it feeds directly into this, is that the combat isn't combative in that way, in that you don't have player roles, GM roles, and you compare, or player attacks, then GM attacks, then player attacks. Instead, it's all player driven. It's always the players making the roll, and they say, right, I want to take out that guard, and the GM, says how challenging that is, and there are opportunities for the players both to roll the dice, but also to kind of bargain away things in order to get themselves an edge, kind of in that. But that then forces you to describe the situation, because the GM has to go, well, actually, this is risky because, there's another guard just around the corner and he'll very easily see what you're doing. So that makes it harder for you to take him out in kind of one blow and things like that. So immediately you're having to describe the combat beyond just the dice roll. And before you even get to the dice roll, you're describing that situation. So I think that's another interesting axis on it.
Definitely. So that sort of game system is very interesting for that. I've never directly played Blades in the Dark itself, although I have played a sci-fi game which uses the Blades in the Dark system. And I've also played a cyberpunk game called Neon City Overdrive, which uses something very similar to the Powered by the Apocalypse type engine, although it's a D6-based thing. These games are a lot of fun, but they do suit certain personality types and not others. So I kind of like them, but I can only handle them in short doses because of the need to constantly improvise descriptions in combat. So for me, it's gone a little bit too far in that direction, and it gives me a little bit of a headache when I play it. But it's fun.
It is that, like you say, it's that continuum, isn't it? And that's a much more at the narrative side of it.
Very much so, yeah.
And I think that propensity to want more description or less description, everyone is different. But I think for me, when I was younger and less confident, it was much more challenging when that was put on you as a player than it was later in my role-playing career. And we will come on to that, I think, when we talk about social combat later on, because I know we've got some questions about that. Smiling Tom says, Blades in the Dark nails the balance between having a hit point pool and diminishing capabilities while fight goes on. Games based on hit point pools fail at including that. I think, just to go back to your point, Greg, about the dragon, I know what you mean in terms of making fights like tense and feel like they're full of danger. But I think you'd have to be really careful that a fight with a dragon wasn't stripped down and sort of abstracted, so it became the same length and felt like it was exactly the same as a fight with two guards.
Yeah, like, definitely. That's true. Yeah. The main point I was making was just to try to operate on a lower scale of numbers. Yeah. So I mean, your dragon should absolutely be a horrendous opponent. So within my own Runesword game, like the dragon, or the worm, as I've called it, is the toughest opponent you can face, and it's almost unkillable by player characters. You would need to think of something really clever to do to be able to take one on, because you just don't have that many hit points. It can kill people pretty easily with a couple of hits.
It would be like us trying to kill a whale with a sword. Yeah. Like how are you going to do that?
Yeah, or actually. So we're going back. Sorry, my excitement. I knocked my headset there. Right, there's a little combat simulation.
Critical hit on your headphones. Yeah,
definitely. No, so this goes back into what we were talking about earlier about combat simulations, right? So one thing you can do to try and take in kind of real world situations into your RPG combats is to try and think about situations like Lindsay's describing. Like, how would you fight a whale with a sword? Like, it's just, you wouldn't. It's just not possible. But okay, it's a sea animal. But something else to think about is what would you do if you were faced with a polar bear? And there are quite a number of actually fairly horrendous stories about people who've fallen foul of polar bears. And I don't know, they're beautiful animals and wonderful animals, but they can be killing machines. They can literally shrug off gunshots and stuff like that. It's horrendous. So a dragon would be a bit like that, but with breathing fire.
A whale. Sorry. Big damn spear, basically whaling, says Mark McGranahan. Yeah, I mean, you'd call in the bolt throwers, but those whales didn't die when the harpoons hit them. Like, they sometimes struggled for like hours and days. Like, whaling is a horrific business that I, for one, I'm glad that we don't undertake anymore. But you can imagine a whole army of people with bolt throwers attaching them onto the dragon and everyone like holding it down so it couldn't fly off. Like, there's pretty cool descriptions in there.
Exactly, and straight away we've got into something that's much cooler. It's much more narrative. It's much more dynamic. It's much more exciting, and it's not based around crunching numbers to work out how you get the best modifier to kill the dragon. You know, so teams of bolt throwers with harpoons.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah, I also love that. I think play metal at them at increased volume, because we know that they've got really sensitive hearing because they communicate through sound over vast distances. So that'd be torture for them. That'd be awful.
Dragons have to have a weak spot, though, right? Do they, though? I mean, do they?
I mean, that's Tolkien's influence again, isn't it?
I mean, it can be, and also you do find that trope in other kind of classic fantasy stuff as well. I mean, moving away from dragons, if you think about one of my favorites, the old Ray Harryhausen films in Jason and the Argonauts, when they have to fight Talos, the Titan. His weakness is his heel, where you can let out the mana that powers him, sort of thing. So things like that are also cool because they create narrative opportunities to construct a story around the combat. And I think that's really, for me, the key to good RPG combat, which moves it away from the dry kind of number v number idea.
So Smiling Tom asks, RPGs are generally very good at handling skirmish combat, but are there any RPGs with solid rules involving battles at a larger scale and players just being an actor in them?
This is a really good question. It's quite an interesting one, actually, because there aren't many games that do this. And I think the reason is because RPGs just aren't really designed for that level of action. So back in the day, I messed around with a couple of things. So within the Dungeons and Dragons universe, particularly around the AD&D second edition days, there were a couple of attempts to do mass battle rules. So there was the battle system set. That's one word, battle system. I think that was for 1E Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then definitely 2E because I had that book. So it's essentially a miniatures combat game, and it had rules for converting your characters from the role-playing element of that AD&D second edition game system onto tabletop characters, so they could be mixing it up with units of soldiers and stuff. So it's kind of an interesting idea. I wasn't particularly, I don't know, I guess I liked it, but I just never really used it for anything. So that was one thing.
Andy Law has kind of done it for us, and I think there were rules to convert Wifrip characters to Warhammer Fantasy Battle a few
which
editions
would be
ago.
easier than for AD&D.
Yeah, which a few editions ago, but he sort of operated on like the zoom out. So for just like us, it was the Wifrip rules, and then we would kind of like zoom out to sort of like Wifba. Skirmishing, and then we would zoom out to like what are they called, Mighty Empire's board, and then we would and then we would zoom back in for the like the Warhammer Fantasy Battle, like little battles, and it was really interesting. And you would add things like you would convert your character, but then because all the characters in Warhammer PCs have got fate points and fortune points, you would get extra rerolls and things that your character could do would become like special rules and things you could do, and it was fine. It was good.
What I'm hoping, I don't know what Andy's got planned for Lawhammer, but I'm hoping that on the Lawhammer streams that we might get to a point where we get to showcase one of those big battle style mini games. Thinking of like the defensive Altdorf one, which is what I know he's
that was different. Well, that was completely different though, wasn't it? Because the zooming out one was one he did with me with a Mighty Empires when I was taking over Druchiland. But the defense of Altdorf was Greg using like the rules that are more similar to Horus Heresy and the Battle for Armageddon, where you have your stacks, and then we would be characters that would kind of like leadership characters that would add on to the stacks. And that was really good fun. Like I love that way of doing it.
I like the idea of combining Mighty Empires with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, partly because Mighty Empires is an awesome game and greatly underrated, I think. But if you had the time to do it with your group, that would be my recommendation, is that zoom out, zoom in thing combined with something like Mighty Empires for a campaign system. But thinking about other game systems that have tried to do this, also in the 2E days, there was the Birthright campaign setting. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but it was an attempt to introduce what TSR called domain level play. So it was the zoom in, zoom out thing. So essentially, in those days, you had combat was resolved in rounds, dungeon exploration in turns, and each turn was like 10 rounds. Then if you were traveling, it would be in days. And so this campaign set introduced domain level play, where a sort of domain turn was 3 months. And the idea was your characters would be, like heroes of the realm or kings of the realm or whatever. And sometimes they would go off on quests as a little group, and other times they'd be doing this sort of like big campaign stuff. I only briefly dabbled with it. I didn't completely gel with the rules, but there were some nice ideas in there. So I think you could mine that for ideas or information if you could track down a copy.
I think Andy Law has, because that's exactly how it worked. It was as you zoomed out and in that you still had rounds and turns, but they got shorter or longer, and it's actually a really good way. He still uses that, like out of combat, a round would be longer, but it's a really good way to allow people to keep on using the rules that they're familiar with, but narratively interpret them in a different way. Because rolling charm when you are, or rolling, an attack when it's abstracted is very different and provokes a different narrative response, but fundamentally it's the same mechanic that your players need to learn.
Yeah, and it's interesting you should say that about mechanics. So at the moment, I'm in the middle of writing a Game Master's Companion for the Runesword game. And one of the chapters that I'm working on is on varying the scale of the game. So how you can kind of scale up from one-on-one situations to companies of soldiers or whatever, or something along those lines. And the trick is to have a kind of simple game mechanic that scales very easily. So in the case of my game, everything's based around rolling a d10. So when you're one-on-one, you're just a character rolling a d10, adding their skill attribute and their weapon proficiency and all that stuff. But the idea I've got for this scaled up level is that the characters will effectively be kind of commanders or leaders of units. And then you can kind of narrate out the story of a battle, but each player who's participating can effectively have their character lead a unit and still resolve it fairly simply, just with a handful of die rolls, and using the same mechanics, so they don't need to learn a new battle system. They just need to have a different idea of the narrative they're creating with those rolls.
Yeah. And that can definitely work, because I know I forget the name of the system, but the system that it was either the Firefly or the Serenity or both. I can't remember RPGs, but they used the same like stats for the ships essentially as they did for the players. So your players at your RPG scale, but then if you were in your ships flying, it was essentially the same stats you were using. Just they were describing the ship instead, and the ships were fighting. So that mechanically, it was very easy to just shift to that. So
now I'll just interject with something else here, because of course, most of us think of fantasy first and foremost when we think of RPGs, but sci-fi is also cool. So for those of you out there who are just stuck in fantasy land, do give some sci-fi stuff a go at some point. So the original question was about, I think, solid rules for larger scale things. The Alien RPG from Fiiiiight has an interesting rule set for ship-to-ship space combat, where the player characters each have a role within the ship, and they're all trying to do different things but coordinate together in order to win the fight. So there'd be like a gunner, a captain, a comms officer, and an engineer who's trying to like give you the extra 20% from the reactor and all that kind of stuff. So I think that sounds really cool. I haven't actually tried it myself because, to turn my point full circle, I don't play Alien RPG to have ship-to-ship combats. It's supposed to be a kind of horror game. So
I was thinking that sounds like something I'd expect in a Star Trek RPG, not something I'd expect in an Alien RPG.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think I would ever use the rules within Alien itself, but if you're after something that's more kind of vehicle or sci-fi based, then I would definitely check it out, and it could easily be adapted to battle mechs or tanks or whatever it is you want to do.
So just a follow-up really to Smiling Tom's question, which was about the rule base. But Seago asks, is it better to run mass combat as a series of skirmishes with the player actively involved, or for them just to be an actor in a scene with mass combat rules, not considering their individual actions?
I think ultimately it is up to the preference for your gaming group. So my instinct is to go with the former, where the battle is basically providing a backdrop for stuff. Honestly, I almost never do this in my games. I usually have the battles as more like the scrolling text at the start of a Star Wars film, where it explains what's happened, and then the action starts. Like, oh, you've been taken prisoner, or oh, the king's army's been routed and you're in the thick of it, what are you going to do? Or that kind of stuff. So that's my approach.
I think a good model is like Bernard Cornwell, and all of his novels really, but particularly Sharp. There's always battles going on, but because again he's got the advantage of there's gun smoke and stuff like that obscuring parts of it. But really we're just following Sharp and his chosen men on their little adventure in the middle of the bigger thing.
Exactly.
They may be the ones that turn the tide, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other people having their own stories somewhere else. We're just not focusing on them. We're focusing on these guys. So.
I also think like player agency, but also what the GM wants to do is really important, because not every battle is like Warhammer Fantasy battles and battle games. You get points and you're supposed to be pretty evenly matched, right? You don't play games and be like, right, well, you might. I'm having 3,000 points and you're only getting 500. See how you get on with that. But in your story as a GM, every battle's not going to be evenly matched. So would you want your players to be jumping in and thinking that they could win it, but actually being hopelessly outclassed, or vice versa? Like, it wouldn't be very satisfying.
That's the problem.
You have to judge really carefully. Do you know what you want to happen in the battle, and will it happen anyway? Or do you genuinely want to give your players an opportunity to influence the outcome of that battle?
Yeah, definitely. I think that is the key question. So I think my advice would be, if the battle is taking place within your campaign world as a kind of grand strategic tactical backdrop to what's going on, however you want to describe it, then I would probably just include it narratively in the campaign and then move on to the next scene where the players can do something meaningful, like assassinate the enemy warlord, or get the princess safely off the battlefield, or stuff like that. Those are cool kind of skirmish level things where individual people can make a big difference. I think if you do want the players to be able to kind of alter the course of the battle, then what I was talking about before, where you kind of bump up the PCs to make them effectively officers of a company or a regiment of men, would be the way I would do it. One of those.
To sort of switch to slightly randomly, but computer games, but not computer RPGs, but first-person shooters. I don't know if you ever played Battlefield 1, which was the World War I set.
Yes, I did. Battlefield in 1942, I think it was. Yeah.
Well, no, but there was one specifically called Battlefield 1. It's more recent than that.
Oh, it was the First World War.
The First World War, and it had a mode in it which was like a narrative of like a campaign in the war.
Okay.
And then what you would do is there were these crutch points, and it would be like, if you could turn the tide here and capture that bridge, then the campaign kind of moved on. And again, that might be a model, like very for what you're saying in terms of integrating the scene in which the characters can make a difference, and then that difference then almost branches the narrative into somewhere else. So
So we've done that one. Let's go back to you and your rules writing. So Lazy Cat asks, how does your real life experience of weapons training influence your approach to writing rules, presumably rules for combat?
So in a strange way, it's helped me write simpler and simpler game rules for combat, because I've realized the futility of trying to simulate anything approaching realistic combat conditions using dice and a pen and paper. And games which I feel like go too far down that route are inherently flawed, because they're creating a complex rule set which maybe for some people feels like it's more realistic because there are 12 different modifiers every time you try to make an attack. And I am looking at you, Shadowrun 3rd edition rules. So yeah, you can kind of delude yourself into thinking that's more realistic because it's got all these modifiers in it, but it's completely abstract. You're putting numbers on something which has nothing to do with numbers. And so I would say that my development as a fencer, as a martial artist, has made me realize that you have to step away from that level of detail and try to aim for something which is more about catching the spirit or the feel of a fight, rather than worrying too much about the minutiae of it, let's say.
What I find quite interesting is when Andy Law is writing combat rules and like tweaking the Warhammer ones for Lawhammer, or writing his own, and in that game in Wifrip you've got talents, which and in Wifrip 3rd edition you had like different maneuvers you could do, but specifically about talents. What I found really interesting is it actually goes the other way. So like Andy will describe something that he wants a talent to do, like be a disarm, and I will think of like the particular kata or the thing I would do that would fit that. And would then be like, yeah, so that can stand alone by itself, because I couldn't just do that the first time I pick up a sword. I did need to learn that as a particular technique, and it fits in. So there's been much more backwards and forwards between us. It's not about, this is what we do, and then you're going to write down the rules to abstract that. It's more, this is the rules I've written, and me thinking, yeah, so if I was doing that, that's the maneuver I'd use. So yeah, that's a useful, good maneuver that makes sense.
Yeah, so stuff like that is useful to do, and I think Warhammer of all the role playing games has made the best attempts to capture the realism of medieval style combat, because it has things like or it used to anyway in first edition. It had the disarm skill, and there were maneuvers you could do in combat. You could actively try to parry something, for example, and I think if I remember correctly, there was a way you could use offhand weapons as well to make yourself better at fencing and all this kind of stuff. So that's definitely one route to go down. The other is just to leave these things up to the narrative description of the players. So, if you're wanting to disarm the opponent's weapon, and this is the approach I would take in the Runesword game, and as GM, I would say, okay, well, you have to make a skill check, because skill is an attribute in that game. So if you're a skilled fighter, you'll be able to do that probably, or you're more likely to be able to do it. If you're an unskilled fighter, well, you can still try it and it might work, but maybe like a 1 in 10 chance.
And I think in a game that has a career system, it's quite important to have those talents and those maneuvers that then differentiate. So you very much differentiate between a duelist who's been trained in, 16th century fencing compared to, I don't know, a Scottish clansman wielding a claymore as he charges down a hill.
Definitely.
Careers in a career-based game.
Yeah, but I think Warhammer does a good job of keeping it relatively grounded, while the newer editions of Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, for example, just go a bit bananas and make all the kind of maneuvers and abilities superpowers. So those games are quite interesting in one way, because they are appealing to people who've got into fantasy and sci-fi, I think, through the Marvel Cinematic Universe and comic books and stuff, because that's the sort of fight that they ultimately simulate. So it goes back yet again to it being a matter of personal preference. If you want to simulate a superhero battle where you're punching each other through buildings and summoning lightning storms from the sky and shrugging off, bolt thrower shots or whatever it is, then, Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder have the tools to allow you to do that. But I think if you're interested in telling a more grounded narrative, something which is closer to the sort of inspirational literature that kickstarted role-playing, which is your kind of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse or Conan, Elric of Melniboné, stuff like that, then you need those more skill-oriented approaches to fights rather than superpower approaches, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So a quick fire round. Lindsay asks, this is me. I decided to ask it based on your great idea last week, Andy, of having a regular Room 101, but I have chosen the Garret window to be my Room 101. So which overdone RPG combat trope would you like to throw out the Garret window of the Rookery?
I would like to throw out that the idea that if you're big and strong, you can be really good fighting with certain types of weapon, and if you're a bit kind of nimble, or dare I say it, even a bit namby-pamby, then you'd fight with a rapier. As somebody who's been studying rapier fencing for a long time, a rapier is not a namby-pamby weapon, and you do need a reasonable amount of strength to use it. And on the other hand, you also need a fair amount of dexterity to use two-handed swords and broadswords and all that. So, yeah, chuck out all those D&D tropes about how weapons are used. They're nonsense.
So I saw a TikTok the other day, which was exactly that. It was someone who was like doing a longsword and like a figure eight, and then doing like a greatsword and going like, well, look, this one's much slower than that one. And I was like, yeah, but you would never actually do that. You would use both of those weapons according to the strengths of those weapons. Like you could be just as quick with one as the other. And it made me really mad too. Andy, Leith, what's your overdone RPG combat?
Interesting. I mean, part of it is that. Part of that is I like, and I mentioned this on the Chimera stream is that two-handed swords are always presented as this incredibly heavy, slow, and there's no real representation of kind of the two-handed longsword fencing, which is actually very fast and wielded in different ways and very different strategically. But then I said that before, so that's boring. So instead, I'm going to say hit points. I hate them. To get rid of them, I hate hit points wounds. I much prefer like the way, say, the wound track worked in World of Darkness, like Vampire Masquerade, right?
Yep.
Like you could soak a certain amount of damage. You were taking your damage, and as you were taking it, it started affecting your performance. And like again, if you're playing Rookery Bingo at home, Conspiracy X had a very similar system in its first edition. That again,
Shadowrun as well used the same thing.
Yeah. I much prefer that. And like of all the, and I'll be honest, I've not actually played a D20 system in a long time because I'm not a big fan, generally speaking. But the one that I liked was when I think it was Mongoose went through a period of doing loads of licensed ones in the early noughties, and they did a Babylon 5 one. And what they did with that was they still had hit points, but you started as your level 1 character with hit points, and hit points didn't really go up, or maybe went up by like 1 every now and then. But you had a separate one which was like kind of fatigue or whatever. So in a fist fight, you could take quite a lot of punches before you went down. But if you got shot by PPG, you were going down. And I was sort of like, oh my God, it's a D20 system that actually has jeopardy, that actually feels deadly. And it kind of fitted. So yeah, big, massive hit point pools, get in the sea.
Yeah. I think there's a problem with your mic, maybe, Greg. I don't know if it's brushing against your collar or something, but I'm getting a bit of an echo. Is anyone else getting that?
I'm hearing it. I didn't know where it was coming from. But...
let me see if I can fiddle around with this.
What, has that fixed it? I'm not sure. No, it's still there. Well, we'll crack on, but yeah.
No, sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It's fine when you're talking, so we'll just ask all the questions and you can talk. So let's have a look. FFG Seagull asks, FFG narrative dice system helps make social skills equally valuable in physical combat. Apart from this, have you any other thoughts of how to make better use of social skills in combat?
So I'm not actually familiar with the FFG narrative dice system. So Andy,
shall I leap in and describe it? So the FFG narrative system, it was in Wifrit 3rd edition. It's in their Star Wars. I think Genesis is the name of the system. But it's in their Star Wars game, and it was in Wifrit 3rd edition. And essentially, the dice have different symbols on; they don't have numbers on. And so some of those symbols are like for like a basic success or a basic failure. Some of them slides are just blank, and then some of them give you different types of like boons. And there's sometimes like a normal boon, and then like an awesome boon, and like a normal bad bane, and like a really bad bane. And there's different dice at different sides, which have different ratios of the different things. So depending what you see, you might say, "Oh, I'll do this," but if I do this maneuver, I also get to roll this dice as well. And it is, on the one hand, it's really interesting because it does encourage this kind of narrative stuff. But the problem comes with specificity that they've added to it. So if it's open, or if that's in 3rd edition, the idea was that you had cards for all your maneuvers. So if you're like, "Oh, I'm going to do, an all-out flailing attack," then in that attack, when I play that card, it tells me what happens if I roll boons and what happens if I roll banes. The problem, certainly I found, and I think you found the same, Lindsay, in the Star Wars RPG when we played that, was there were generic rules for what those things did, but also every skill had its own separate rules.
Yeah.
But you had to keep opening the damn rule book and flicking to the page to find out what your skill did, like every time you used it.
I think it was to help people to balance level the playing field for people who like are maybe less good at providing their own narrative and interpreting dice and doing that on the fly. But as a result, it just got a bit frustrating because we had to constantly go backwards and forwards.
Yeah, and it was like if it had a game aid, if it had either the cards in 3rd edition, or I guess if you were playing it in a virtual tabletop system, all the programs in, so you would click your button and it would tell you, and you would go, "Oh, right, this is what happens." But again, I mean, and that would be an interesting question. Like I've not played a lot using virtual tabletop systems. I don't know if you have, Greg.
No, not at all.
I know a lot of people in our chat probably will have, and I do wonder how much those systems encourage, or I would suspect discourage, narrative in combat. But that's maybe a question for another day. But
yeah. The influence of virtual tabletops is let's not open that can of worms.
But yeah, so with that system, it was the same system that you would use for your physical combat if you were, shooting or fighting or whatever. But also there was like social things. So again, in Wifrit 3rd edition, there were social attack cards you could play. So if you were in a masquerade ball and you were trying to get information out of somebody, you go, "Oh, I'll use my disarming smile maneuver," or whatever, and would roll your dice to sort of and then, "Oh, I managed to get that piece of information," or "I managed to influence that person in another way." So it essentially meant it was basically the exact same system. And I think I think lots of other systems have done that, but in a stealth way. I remember the moment when Andy pointed out to me what should have been blindingly obvious in World of Darkness and Vampire, that the stats, the physical, mental, social, that actually they all were exactly paralleled with each other in terms of how you use them, and that you could use the skills exactly the same way in combat and out of combat. And that was there as an elegant mechanic behind the scenes that almost no GM ever used in the way that it was set up to do. So,
I'm conscious that we don't have much time, and so we'll come back to this and social skills and social combat, but there's a question in the chat that I wanted to bring in. Job says, quite broad, but how might you implement differing styles of fencing, Talhofer or some such? I understand it'd be hard with a pen and a die, but I'd be interested to hear how you might if you had to.
I think the answer is, sorry to repeat myself a lot, but it's you do it narratively. So I don't personally see the benefit in trying to introduce a lot of mechanics to differentiate different fencing styles. And I did consider that when I was writing my own fantasy game, of course, but I fairly swiftly discarded it because it would have led me down the path of lots of special abilities and probably a bit more crunch, which I wanted to avoid. I mean, one way you could do it is just to look at the sorts of weapons and skills which a typical style would advocate. For those who don't know, Talhofer is like quite a well-known medieval German master, but he actually had a whole bunch of different weapons in his treatise. So I'm not sure, how you would go about narrowing it down. So like I say, maybe that's not really an answer for your question, but I would personally do it narratively in my own game. Like I would describe, a bad guy who was, I don't know, skilled at Spanish rapier fencing or the fantasy equivalent, that he would take a certain stance and he'd hold his weapon a certain way, and you would know that he was trained by the masters of Toledo or wherever. So I feel like that's a more flavorful way of doing it without saying like, you get an extra dice in this situation, or you get +2 to do this sort of maneuver. It's not to my taste to try and do it that way.
I mean, it's interesting. Like on that, this never came to me. This is one of these sort of Schrodinger's rules. But when Andy and I were working on Wifrit before we sort of stepped away from it for the Altdorf book, we were actually going to introduce schools of fighting into kind of Wifrit. But the way we were going to do it was around like introducing maneuvers, which is not really a thing in Wifrit, but it would be the idea that if you were trained, you would buy the talent which showed you were trained, which would be like you say, people could tell from your stance that was where you'd been trained. And then it would be things like you can disarm as a free action, or you're using a big weapon but actually you know how to reverse the hilt, so you can use infighting with it and things like that. But the challenge we were having as we were writing it was the recurring theme in the stream was the balance between granularity and narrative, and how much detail is too much detail. And I think we had it just about worked out, but
just to go back to the narrative dice, the biggest thing was the narrative dice was it was not a pass-fail type roll. There were variations on Shades of Grey, and I hated that. I actually hated it because, and I know it's really like stupid because in real life you don't know this, but I feel like in real life you kind of have an estimate of your abilities, and I like a percentage system or something that tells me as a player what my because I'm not my character, I'm a player playing that character, and I found it so confusing to understand like what would happen, like what the chances were. Am I doing something that's like really difficult, really easy? Is my character going to be able to do it? And I never ever used like you could go like more aggressive. And I just never used it because I just couldn't understand what the risk was. So it wasn't for me. I could understand what they tried to do, but it actually made me less engaged with the narrative and more confused about things. When I think for other people it may have been different.
I think it depends on what. Oh, sorry, on you go.
No, you're the guest. You go first.
All right, thank you. So it depends on the type of player you are, really. So, I mean, I absolutely share your reservations about the system, Lindsay. I get really frustrated by stuff like that. I want to know the chances of success, basically, and I feel like a trained professional would have some inkling of, like how long is it going to take me to pick this lock, or is it an unpickable lock? Or in combat, like, well, I know what I'm doing with a broadsword, or I'm a total klutz and I'm not sure even how to stand on guard. Your character would know that. However, people who, in my experience, come from a more, let's say, arty, drama, improvisational type background do tend to thrive more on the narrative rule sets. So I think they're just for a certain type of player and maybe not for me and you.
Also, Andy Law constantly assured me that you did know the chance. It's just I couldn't understand the dice. I was just like, because they clearly, you could tell, like the yellow ones were better than the other ones. I don't know.
Yeah, like you could work it out, but you would. Yeah, but it was hard because there were so many different dice. I absolutely agree, and I think it's as well as the fact that, as you were saying, both Greg and Lindsay, like that as a person in the real world, if the character was real, they would have some idea of their skill. There's also the fact that fundamentally these are role-playing games, and as players, like we should have some sense of what we're committing our characters to as we do it. If we want to go for the long shot, we should. That's fine, but we should know that it's a long shot. All I was going to say before, Lindsay, was because I totally agree. Like what I love about percentile systems is it's really easy to work out the odds. 70%, I've got a 70% chance. Great, I understand that. But that might be why they thought it was perfect for Star Wars, right? Because Han Solo said, "Never tell me the odds." So that's all I was going to say. It's a bad Star Wars joke.
Yeah. Okay. So I ask, there are two English teachers on the panel tonight. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask for their favorite fight or battle scene in literature.
It's a good question.
While you think about that, funnily enough, someone earlier in the chat talked about Wheel of Time. Rand's battle with Ishmael mirrors the battle with the Seanchan. I literally just in the past 3 weeks completely reread that series, and I have to say that final book was such a grind, just reading about the last battle on and on and on and on, and then not finding out what happened to any of them afterwards. I was much more disappointed with it than I was the first time I read it.
So
anyway,
have you got an answer, Greg? I do, but you can go first if you want.
I mean, like an early favorite in my fantasy career, if you like, is David Gemmell's Legend. Like the battle descriptions of that are awesome. It's just everything you could want from a kind of gritty but heroic fantasy. So in terms of battle scenes, I think he really nails the vibe of what I'm looking for in that sort of fantasy. So yeah, for battle scenes, that one. I'll come back to individual fight scenes. I'm still thinking that one over.
So for me, like I've already mentioned it, but like Bernard Cornwell, like I think he's the master of it. I adore the Sharp books. I adore the Last Kingdom. I think he there's something about the way he writes that he captures a kind of a pace that's engaging, and you get the sweep and scale of it, but then you get the individual. In terms of a fight, it's interesting. This wasn't what I was going to say until today's discussion of bringing down a dragon with bolt throwers and whales and stuff like that. The Old Man in the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I don't know if you've read it, but it's this old man who's out fishing, and it's a big marlin basically that he spears, and then it pulls his boat way out away from the island into the sea, and he's kind of lost at sea for ages, locked in this kind of life and death struggle with this big fish. And actually, in terms of a fight, now I hadn't really thought about it as a fight before, but now I'm like, yeah, it kind of is actually, and it's absolutely gripping in that very classic Hemingway sparse description, but yet somehow incredibly evocative. So yeah,
Hemingway is a genius. Yeah.
I've never read that book, and I didn't even know what it was about. And I thought like The Old Man and the Sea was like some kind of like allegory or metaphor for something. Clearly not. It's literally just an old man, the sea, and a fish. Good to know. So we don't really have time.
It's an existential symbol, but we'll talk
obviously,
about that
right? Obviously. Well, that's us. We come to the end of our chat. We talked before about never getting through all the questions, and we didn't get through all the questions again. So thank you so much for coming on, Greig. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Yeah. For those who are interested, the echo. I fixed the echo on Greig's mic by switching off echo cancellation in the settings I have on my side. So thanks for nothing, echo cancellation. So thank you, as always, to all of our patrons who support us and make the streams happen. Thank you to our Discord community, which is a lovely community. Please do check it out. And of course, thanks to my fellow Rook Andy. Thank you most of all to Greig for coming and talking to us about some really interesting rules, but also combat in real life chat. And until the next time, we remain inside the Rookery. See you again. Good night and caw-caw, caw-caw.